Meanwhile, somewhere in the world of Great Sin, a report about the potentially scoutable candidates was being presented. At first, the report about the students who have already enrolled in Rodlin's Academy was being analyzed. The one analyzing the report was Sinclair Calche, an Aura Master Duke who was also an officer. Smirking with amusement, he stared at the tablet and stated that the Everlast Company's daughter had created a new type of potion, further questioning if they were making it available commercially. His assistant responded affirmatively to his question, further stating that they had named it the Everlast Potion and were currently monopolizing its sales. Instantly, the Duke asked her if she had a sample, to which she responded with a "Yes, sir." Staring at the potion, he wondered how it was too small and told if she already made this while only being a first-year student. Surely many people will try to recruit her when she graduates, to which the assistant pointed out that was the reason why they needed to connect with her now. Agreeing to her, he further told her to check if there were any others who have got their eyes on her, and instantly drank the potion. With a look of jealousy, he clenched the empty potion bottle tightly with his hand. Curious by his reaction, the assistant maintaining her glasses asked how it was. Staring at his clenched fist, he exclaimed how the potion surprised him, further commenting how it was several times more effective than the ones currently available on the market, claiming it had no side effects, and if they manage to commercialize this, it will revolutionize the market. Addressing His Excellency, she explained there was another thing worth taking note of. Pointing at the tablet, she told how the report stated that the potion was co-created. Staring at the report with Andreas's picture, he instantly recognized him to be Cain Cromwell's son. But he still couldn't comprehend and questioned if he had a talent for potion making from the beginning. Pointing her finger up, she exclaimed how it didn't seem like it, as there was also a rumor circulating, saying that he took advantage of her. But the Duke questioned if it were to be true, then would there be any reason for her to add his name, to which she replied with no further stating, since neither household holds any particular relationship to the other. Interrupting her with a yawn, he told her that they should investigate it, and if he had awakened a talent, then add him to the scouting list. Writing all the instructions down, the assistant claimed she understood, while the Duke, closing his eyes, laid back on the chair. Later that night, somewhere in the world of Great Sin, as the rain poured, a mysterious man holding a glass of wine asked his underling how the end-of-year award ceremony was going. The underling responded how it was going just as planned by His Majesty, and that the Cromwell family would be demoted. Meanwhile, hearing this, the mysterious old man could not contain his excitement. Stirring his glass of wine, he called the name Andreas Cromwell. He gave a cunning smile as he opened his eyes wide open with a look of anticipation. He claimed that he was looking forward to seeing if Andreas was different from his father. Meanwhile, in the dormitory, Andreas was swinging his sword relentlessly. It was his 9,999th swing. As he gasped for air, he drew back his sword and took a long breath, preparing to launch for another strike. He swung the sword with immense force as he completed his training of 10,000 swing. This left him exhausted, making him fall to the floor trembling as he took deep, long breaths to recover. He instantly reached for the potion that was on the table. As he drank the potion, he wondered how it would be impossible for him to do it without these potions. The regeneration potion increases the recovery rate of his muscles, while the healing potion takes care of his fatigue, and by adding the physical reinforcement potion, he had basically created a system to train infinitely. Looking at the potions, he thought how it was a gamble, but concluded that evolving his potion brewing talent was the right choice. Reminiscing about the time he evolved the talent, he wondered how much he stressed at first, but after some time he decided to evolve it anyway, since the risk was low enough. When he agreed to the evolution, multiple system notifications popped up stating that he had successfully evolved the potion creation, which had further been upgraded from ordinary to extraordinary. The results were so amazing that he felt like an idiot for even worrying about it. He can create way more potions now as the success rate and creation speed increased substantially as well. As long as everything kept going that way, and he did his best, he was convinced that he will be able to grow well. As he continued resting, he thought if he could get a good corpse and some items, he wouldn't need to worry about his fight strength, and since Sharon was always away, he couldn't sell a page of sloth to him immediately. Whenever he visited Karen's office, all he could find was a note stating he was away due to an urgent business trip. He questioned if Sharon was in such a bad mood that he went traveling, and couldn't even let his disciple know, further exclaiming why he was so petty. After freshening up, he got annoyed by the thought that he had no other connections besides him. However, since he had medical botany classes tomorrow morning, he concluded that he should stop worrying and go to sleep. The next morning, as Andreas arrived at the classroom, all he could see was a notice on the board today from Professor Vauban stating that today's class will be taught outdoors, as was notified via their tablets. Andreas was left in a state of panic. He realized that this was all Vauban's doing. Trying to contain his anger, he wondered how Vauban must be laughing at him, further questioning himself if he knew Andreas didn't have a tablet and whether he was using it to get him. Hurriedly, he ran towards the garden, wondering what the hell he was thinking of doing with the students. He reached the Rodland Academy garden, where the class was being held. He stood in a state of shock as he witnessed everybody so busy on their own. As he looked further, he saw everybody experimenting individually and making potions. Some were in a panicked state as they couldn't figure out the right ratios, while some were running hastily, leaving him puzzled as to what was happening and why everyone was hurrying so much. With a surprised look, he realized it was an exam somehow. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted. He gave an annoyed look as heard Vauban addressing his name, saying he was late. Without any hesitation, the professor continued to mock him, saying how it seemed like he was so busy with his own research that he didn't see the notice. Biting his lips in frustration, he wondered how immature a person could be. Abruptly, somebody pulled his robe, leaving him surprised. It was none other than Lucia. Glancing at Andreas, she pulled him, telling him to come with her, and she would explain it all to him. Meanwhile, Vauban was smirking as he watched him being dragged by Lucia. Lucia told Andreas to just buy a tablet at this point, claiming that he had the money. As Andreas stared at the tablet, she wondered how long did he think she would keep showing her tablet to him. Immediately, Lucia, pointing at the picture of Vauban, explained how he discovered an awakening potion and came up with the idea to make an exam to analyze it just like that. As Andreas started to gather the equipment, he wondered how the professor must have felt the need to brag about it. Meanwhile, the professor standing near Andreas came closer to him and with a sarcastic tone said, for someone of his caliber, figuring out the ingredients and the proportions of this potion must be a breeze. With an annoyed look, Andreas thought how the professor was an obstinate bastard. He couldn't contain his excitement as he thought to himself how there was no need to be ashamed and that he had a very bright future ahead of him, and said today he would finally expose for what he is, to which Andreas commented that he mixed up what he meant to say and his real intentions. As he realized his mistake, he was even more furious at Andreas as he thought he was someone who took advantage of Miss Everlast, the rising star of the potion world, claiming him to be nothing more than a trashy student. Paying no attention to him, they continued focusing on their experiments. 4 hours later, the test had finally ended. Witnessing the results on his tablet, Vauban was too stunned to see the analysis test results, where the first one to complete was Lucia, who finished at 1 hour, 22 minutes and 16 seconds with a 100% success rate. The second one to complete was none other than Andreas, who finished at 2 hours, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, also with a 100% success rate. However, with 96% success rate, Talon finished it at 3 hours, 23 minutes and 1 second. Vauban still couldn't comprehend how Andreas, who was late, had come second, and that too with a 100% success rate. Meanwhile, another invigilator who was pretty sure claimed that there was no cheating of any kind during the exam. Seeing the results, even his classmates were dumbfounded as one of the students exclaimed that Andreas really had a talent for making potions. Meanwhile, behind her, another student was lost in despair as he wondered how he lost to someone like Andreas. Lucia, with excitement in her face, called him Senior Seaweed and congratulated him for a job well done. With an annoyed look, he told her that his name is not Seaweed, but Andreas. All of a sudden, they were startled by someone who swiftly rushed past them yelling, "Professor Vauban." It was a student who, in a state of panic, rushed towards the professor, shouting why the professor did this to him. With a worried look, the professor glanced towards the student, instantly realizing who he was. He exclaimed, "You are." As Andreas and Lucia were left in a state of shock, hearing the student, who couldn't control his anger, question in a loud tone as to why the professor claimed the potion he made as his own. The student, who was furious at the professor, asked him how he could do this and further claimed how he knew more than anyone else how much effort he put into making that potion. Every student who was standing there was shocked to hear his accusations, as one of them whispered if Senior Giralf wasn't mistaken, while the other one claimed how he never expected the teacher to be the type to do something like this. To confirm his suspicion, Andreas turned towards Lucia, asking what she thought. In response, Lucia stated if it was Professor Vauban, she was certain he would probably do this. To which Andreas replied he was thinking the same thing as he walked forward. Lucia, as she felt ignored, yelled at Andreas to hold on, asking where he was going. With an agitated look, Lucia wondered how Andreas was ignoring her even though she saved him yesterday, and so she decided that she won't care about him anymore, calling him a stupid, stubborn seaweed. Meanwhile, Andreas told the professor that he had a question related to the ingredients of the potion. Pointing towards Andreas, The professor asked in a sarcastic tone if he could not see that this wasn't a good time. While Senior Giralf was accusing the professor, he glanced at Andreas in surprise. With a calm look, Andreas pointed out how it was related to this situation, further claiming if this was the professor's work, he should be able to prove that he made it right here, right now. Bewildered by Andreas' statement, the professor was left in shock as he wondered about calling Andreas shithead. The professor tried to stay calm, while Senior Giralf, with a pleased look, asked what he meant by proving he made it and questioned if he meant something like the Magic Tower examination. Agreeing to his statement, Andreas questioned the professor if he had truly made the potion, he should be able to explain why he used which materials easily, further commenting if perhaps he was not confident enough. Even though the professor was worried, he tried to stay calm and asked Andreas if he really thought he was not confident, further claiming that he was a professor at the prestigious Rodland Academy. Without any hesitation, Andreas immediately told him if he was confident he should be able to answer the question and ask him why he changed the upriver resin to cytomine petals. Startled by the sudden question, the professor looked worried as he wondered how he had been so distracted by the presentation day that he forgot to check that part. Senior Giralf, sensing the professor's wariness, asked why the professor wasn't answering right away. All of this was being monitored by the Tower Master's loyal eagle, Stormbringer. The professor answered that he used the petals to cut costs further, claiming if Andreas was the one developing it, he would have known. Analyzing his answer, Andreas proceeded to ask about the proportion. Meanwhile, the professor yelled what the hell he thought he was doing and claimed that only the magic towers can perform potion examination. Without paying much attention to him, Andreas asked his last question as to why he used the more expensive jelly beetle instead of papina powder. The professor couldn't answer the question as he stood in complete silence being watched by all of the students. All of the students who watched all this started to whisper among themselves as to why the professor wasn't answering. Meanwhile, the professor could only clench his lips in frustration as he did not know the answer. As the students were gossiping among themselves, one of them questioned if he really stole it, while the other one told to think that even the professor would think to claim the research of his students as his own. The professor was left in an embarrassment as there was nothing he could do now. So he clenched his fist as he tried to come up with an answer and said that it was because paprika powder had a hallucinogenic effect. And so that was the reason why he used beetles, even though they were more costly. Hearing his answer, Senior Giralf called Professor, stating that it wasn't why he used the powder. The reason why he used the powder was because the powder gets heated for a long time while the potion is being made, which can give the one who consumes a stomach ache. This left the professor even more panicked as he yelled how they were wrong, and it was definitely because of the hallucinogenic effects. To which Senior Giralf told that he just remembered something and told him that he did tell him the powder had side effects but didn't tell him that it was a hallucinogenic effect and questioned him to explain how he came up with the answer. Hearing this left the professor dumbfounded. Abruptly, one of the students pointing towards the professor shouted, asking him if he didn't have any shame as a scientist, while the other one accused him, stating that he would go this far to steal credits from his own disciple, further ordering him to resign right now. The professor was too stunned to hear all these accusations from his students, while Andreas glanced at the students as he witnessed all this. The students continued to accuse him, calling him a thief and a scammer, which made the professor clench his teeth as he was about to lose his temper. Immediately, he screamed in frustration, claiming that they were the scammers. Pointing at Senior Giralf and Andreas, the professor stated that the two of them planned all of this, further yelling that he would report to the disciplinary committee. Hearing this from the professor, Andreas wondered how he really reached rock bottom, and that when a child throws a tantrum, there's no choice but to leave it to the adults. Meanwhile, the students behind him were shouting how they should boycott the professor and that he would be the one to be punished. Andreas again told if he was so annoyed, he could ask Sir Alvin to set up a place for him to explain everything. The professor opened his eyes wide open in amazement as he heard Andreas. Andreas instantly reached inside his pocket, telling that it would be possible, and took out the card given to him by Sir Alvin and said he was being sponsored by him, so it was possible. Meanwhile, Senior Giralf glanced at Andreas in surprise. Lucia, who was watching all this, was impressed as she wondered how Andreas was using the card given to buy the materials to threaten him and thought maybe he would actually fall for it. All of his anger turned into shame as he opened his fist, trembling in fear. Looking at the professor, Andreas questioned him what's wrong and asked if he didn't want to explain himself. Meanwhile, hearing this, the professor could not control his trembling, and it looked like he had been caught. The professor stood in complete silence as he could defend himself anymore. Meanwhile, Sir Alvian, who was watching all this commotion happen, wondered how a brat like Andreas misused the card that was given to him to threaten the professor. As the professor fell to the ground ashamed of his actions, Bart Alvin monitored all this with the eyes of his eagle and thought about how the Professor Vauban was stealing his disciple's potion, and since he caused such a commotion, he would definitely make him pay for it later. But the most surprising part for Bart Alvin was how Andreas had really done his research, and with a cunning smile, he further wondered how cheeky it was of Andreas to use his name. As he analyzed Andreas's actions, he was certain that he knew the theory and ingredients behind the awakening potion. As the eagle flew away, he concluded how it might be possible that Andreas would discover a new medicine before the year ends. Meanwhile, the professor, who was looking down, ashamed of his actions as tears filled his eyes, could not utter a word. Instantly, the eagle was high up in the sky as the tower master claimed how he would be looking forward to it and called Andreas Cain's son. So the eagle flew past the clouds away from the commotion. After the commotion had settled down, Andreas decided to head to the Academy's cafeteria. As he sat down to have his lunch, he was accompanied by Lucia and Vivian, who sat in front of him. Lucia, staring at Andreas, wondered how he actually invited her to eat together, but could not comprehend how it would be in the Academy's cafeteria. Meanwhile, Andreas, who was chewing his food, asked Lucia if she was not going to eat, further claiming that it was really good. Flustered by his question, Lucia responded saying she would and grabbed the food in front of her while Vivian, sitting beside her, was calmly enjoying her meal. Suddenly, Lucia shouted it was hot as she grabbed her hands. Witnessing all this, not only Andreas and Vivian, but everyone that was near stared at Lucia in confusion. Andreas, picking up the steak, sarcastically called Lucia "rich lady" and told her that she should do it like that, further demonstrating it to her. He instructed her to grab the steak from the edge like that and then drown it in sauce. As Lucia tried to defend herself, claiming that it didn't matter how rich she was, Andreas raised the piece of steak near her and gave it to her. Puzzled by this, Lucia stared at the steak, wondering how Andreas could also enjoy eating in the cafeteria. As Lucia grabbed the steak for Andreas's hand, Vivian glanced at them and requested a piece for her too. Meanwhile, Lucia glanced at Vivian as she chewed her steak. Confused by her sudden request, Andreas asked what she meant. Pointing towards Lucia's steak, Vivian said that she wanted a piece too. This reaction by Vivian left Andreas amazed, as he never expected Vivian to say something like that. With a smile on his face, Andreas grabbed another piece and offered it to Vivian. As they finished their meal, they decided to leave the Academy's cafeteria. While they were leaving, Lucia called Andreas Sr. and asked when he was going to buy a tablet, and further pointed out that if he had one, he would have been notified if an event like the one today were to happen again, and that he wouldn't miss it, and claimed it would be useful, to which Andreas responded stating he was saving money right now. Unpleasant with his answer, Lucia told him that it was not even that expensive in the first place. Then Andreas sarcastically replied that nothing was expensive for a rich lady like her. Understanding the sarcasm, Lucia instantly called Andreas seaweed. Meanwhile, Vivian was still blushing as she wondered how Mr. Fairy gave her meat. Vivian, with a pleased look, turned towards Andreas and asked if Mr. Fairy also wanted her reward, to which Andreas turned his gaze in panic, stating no need, and further asked why Vivian was even calling him Mr. Fairy. Puzzled by all this, Lucia stood wondering what Mr. Fairy meant. As they walked forward, Andreas, pointing to his left, told the both of them that he would be going now. Listening to Andreas, Lucia was dumbfounded and questioned him what he meant, as they just ate, but still bid Andreas a farewell, stating how she would see him later, to which Andreas waved goodbye, calling Vivian, telling her that he would see her later too. Meanwhile, Vivian kept waving her hand while her gaze was fixed at Andreas. Instantly after they bid their farewell, Andreas left them and walked away towards the opposite direction. As Andreas walked in the corridor, the windows reflecting the light of the sunset made him realize that it was already dawn. He then closed his eyes for a moment as he wondered about all things he had gone through, and with a new resolve he opened his eyes and was determined to do anything to survive and live in the world of great sin as Andreas Cornwall. Then, as he walked forward, he saw a shadow figure approaching him. Looking at the shadow, he instantly realized who it was. It was none other than Sharon, his professor. As Andreas stared at Sharon, he was glad that Sharon had finally returned. As they got closer, they stared at each other, Andreas with a look of determination while Sharon with a look of confusion. Then bowing down to his professor, Andreas politely stated how it seemed that the master had finally returned from his trip. In response, Sharon just walked past him and told him to come to his lab at noon tomorrow. Even after Sharon walked away, not paying much attention to Andreas, he still kept bowing his head. Then turning towards Sharon, Andreas looked at him and told him that he understood. Meanwhile, Andreas, in the back of his mind, wondered how it was finally time to execute his plan with Sharon. The next morning, at the Rodland Academy Alvin Street, there was a shop named World Hammer Handlings where Andreas was checking out a sword to purchase, thinking it was better if he had a sword to protect himself from Sharon, as he knew Sharon was the type of guy that thought everything Andreas had was his, so he had no doubt that Sharon would try to take the page of sloth from him by force. After analyzing the sword, Andreas told the blacksmith that he wanted to purchase this sword, to which the blacksmith questioned if he would like a whetstone to sharpen his sword as well. Suddenly, someone called out his name. As he glanced back, he was astonished to see the person who had called him. Even the blacksmith was shocked as he knew who it was. It was none other than Diane Alvin, the daughter of Bart Alvin, and once a childhood friend of Andreas, who with a look of surprise, asked what he was doing at a blacksmith. Seeing Diane, he instantly turned towards her and bowed his head with respect, stating he needed a sword, to which Diane asked why he needed a sword as he was a mage. With curiosity in his eyes, he stared at what Diane was holding in her hands. He told how it was good to have at least one for self-defense. Noticing Andreas stare at what she held, she quickly told that it was a present for her ogre of a brother. Meanwhile, Andreas thought to himself if the brother she was talking about was Carlos Alvin, the Alvin household's oldest son, who left to train to become a warrior. He reminisced about the times when they both used to irritate and make fun of Diane, which made him remember how they got along pretty well before. He further wondered how Carlos had already died when the game started, so the game had just glossed over him. With a serious look in his eyes, he was pretty sure Carlos died at the Academy's end-of-year event. He remembered how in a game Hazar, after escaping from the Duke Balaric's territory, joined a religious cult known as the Zephyro cult, the same cult that did the terrorist attack at the event, taking lives of Carlos along with many others. Wondering if he could change the fate of Carlos, Andreas asked Diane if Carlos was also participating in the end-of-year event, to which she responded affirmatively in a startled voice. Reminiscing about their time spent together, he smiled, closing his eyes, stating how nice it would be if they could meet again, just the three of them. Hearing what Andreas just said, Diane, being emotional about it, blushed as she asked if what he was saying was really true. After hearing what everyone had been saying about Andreas, she was now sure that he had somehow changed. Shying with nervousness, she looked away from him, thinking how she should ask him. Gathering her confidence, she decided that she should not worry and just ask him normally. Meanwhile, holding his sword, Andreas stood in confusion looking at Diane, who stayed in silence, without breaking a word. Instantly, Andreas asked if there was something she wanted to say to him. Diane was left in a state of panic. She could not ask him what she really wanted to. As Diane had nothing to say to him, he bowed his head, bidding farewell to her. She was bewildered and left speechless, as he bid farewell, before she could even ask what she wanted to. Even though Andreas just walked past her, she could not break a word. All she could do was stand still and watch him leave. She finally gathered her confidence and turned back at Andreas, yelling. She wanted to know why. But she couldn't complete her sentence as Andreas had already left, making her startled. Meanwhile, the other students gazed back at her in confusion. Even the blacksmith was confused as he couldn't comprehend the situation. She was sad that she couldn't complete her conversation with her long-lost childhood friend. As he left the shop, he was still wondering about Carlos and how there was still time until the terrorist incident occurred. As the day went by, Andreas went to the Academy's teaching department where Sharon, looking at his book, explained to Andreas how he had been searching the whole continent for a material of the same quality as Angela, but so far he had not been able to find one. So he intended to keep searching for a little while. Meanwhile, Andreas, with a fierce look, was attentively listening to him. Turning the page of his book, he exclaimed that his hopes weren't high, but he needed it for the congregation this weekend. With confidence in his eyes, he wondered that this is where the game began. If Sharon were to get blinded by greed and ask Andreas to give the page of sloth to him, he would consider it as a win. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted as he heard a loud thump from Sharon closing the book, further stating that they were going to get busy for the time being, so Andreas should brace himself. Abruptly, Andreas called him master and said he would like to talk to him about something, to which he questioned what it was. As the tension grew between them, Andreas slowly leaned forward and claimed that he had managed to get the Apocalypse Codex. In a state of shock, he could not comprehend how someone like Andreas could get his hands on the Codex. Andreas was confused to see Sharon stare at him in complete silence. Not believing what Andreas just said, he coughed, trying to hide his laughter. He further ridiculed Andreas and told him to not say such stupid things because the Codex is not something the likes of him could get his hands on. Meanwhile, Andreas was frustrated that Sharon did not believe him, So to prove himself, he raised his hand and summoned a portal. Claiming it was not something he could handle, he instantly put his hand inside the portal. He was amazed to see the newfound confidence of Andreas and how he summoned the portal out of nowhere. Suddenly, he took out the Apocalypse Codex from the portal. It was glowing bright and was emitting an immense aura around it. He was stunned as he could not believe to see the Apocalypse Codex right before his eyes, and that too in the hands of someone like Andreas. With a cunning look on his face, he bowed down, extending both his hands towards Sharon, offering him the Codex, exclaiming Andreas wants him to have it. He was left speechless as he could not comprehend why Andreas was offering him the Codex. Even though the offer was very tempting, he sighed, refusing the offer, telling Andreas to keep it himself. Suddenly, he got up and stated that it was a highly sought-after item, so keeping it would only spell trouble, further ordering Andreas to take it to the congregation so they could exchange it for another item. Meanwhile, Andreas stayed calm, thinking how his plan was going accordingly. He smirked, wondering how that was exactly what he thought Sharon would say, given that he was the type to prioritize his own life over anything else. Glancing at Andreas, he ordered him to clear his schedule and prepare himself, as they have to go to the congregation this weekend, to which Andreas replied that he understood, Master. The following weekend, they made their way to the congregation as planned. A corpse resurrected by Sharon was riding the carriage. They soon reached the eastern edge of the city, which lies in the confinement zone forest of Captivity adjacent area. Meanwhile, Andreas, who was inside the carriage, wondered how even though he made it through Sharon in one piece, now the problem was going to the congregation. Glancing at Sharon, he further wondered how there will be many dangerous individuals there, and words won't get through to them, so he concluded that he will have to negotiate as safely as possible. With a grim smile, Sharon broke the silence, stating that he will be able to trade the Page of Sloth for items that will help him grow, and was willing to take anything he can get for it. Listening to what Sharon said, Andreas smirked, thinking how he was completely sure that the Page of Sloth was already his, and when push comes to shove, Sharon will use him as a shield. Suddenly, both of them were left in a state of shock as the carriage stopped abruptly, and they felt an immense aura near them. A mysterious person stood in front of the carriage, grabbing the leash of the horses, telling the horses to calm down. Sharon used his resurrected corpse's sight to see who the mysterious person was. As the horses calmed down, the mysterious person, petting the horse, made his way towards the carriage. He reached the door of the carriage and greeted them. Glancing towards them, he smirked and confidently stated how they were going to the congregation, further asking if he could tag along with them. Andreas, with his eyes wide open, gazed towards the mysterious person as he recognized who he was. The mysterious person entered the carriage and sat in front of both of them like he owned it. He was relieved and thankful that he got a ride. Meanwhile, both of them stayed in complete silence, as they could not comprehend if it was fate or all of this was planned. Instantly, he sarcastically commented that the ride was not that great, though. Meanwhile, Andreas, glancing at him, wondered it was none other than Salem, one of the continent's greatest 10, who was even willing to deal with the forbidden for the sake of exploring, thus giving him the name the Devil in pursuit of the truth. Being the cautious guy he is, he thought if the information about the Page of Sloth got leaked, then the situation they were in might not turn out well. Meanwhile, Sharon did not look pleased. He had a dissatisfied look on his face. Suddenly, he was shocked as he heard Salem ask what was with his expression. His veins started popping as he widened his eyes in amusement, asking if Sharon was dissatisfied since he was going to the congregation. Panicking, Sharon instantly responded, saying not at all, addressing him, Sir Salem, giving Salem a startled look on his face. He instantly burst into laughter and addressed Sharon as boy, telling him not to worry, for he had already gone to the congregation several times. Meanwhile, Andreas, with a puzzled look, wondered how he knew he was insane, but to think Salem would go this far was not something he anticipated. Suddenly, he had a troubled look as Salem instantly appeared right before him, addressing him boy, asking what his name was. Sharon ordered him to introduce himself, as he is his senior, Isekai'd. Bowing his head, he introduced himself as Andreas Cromwell, to which Salem gave a surprised look, exclaiming, "Oh my God," and asked if he had gotten his hands on another Cromwell as well. Andreas, with a displeased look, gazed towards Sharon with anger, wondering what Salem was talking about, and how he was saying it in a way that suggested there was some kind of secret about the Cromwell family. Meanwhile, Sharon stayed still, nervously not breaking a word. Salem, understanding everything, shut his mouth, making a weird face, stating how it looked like Andreas did not know anything. Grabbing Andreas by his shoulder, Salem asked if it was all right of him to give him one special piece of advice. Salem's eyes widened as he gazed at Andreas and leaned towards him. He gave a big smile and told struggle as much as possible. Sharon, folding his hands, had a displeased look as he was revealed just now. Meanwhile, Andreas continued to look at him with an intrigued look and thus concluded that looking at Karen's face, he probably shouldn't ask anything about it and wondered what the hell Sharon was hiding from him. As they continued their journey through the foggy forest, a dark shadow started to appear before their carriage. The undead instantly saw the dark shadow that stood before them and informed Sharon. He quickly took the side of the undead and saw who the person was and pulled the leash, stopping the horses abruptly. Sharon sighed as he recognized who was standing in their way. It was an incomplete shadow that emerged from under the ground and glanced towards them with glowing, devilish eyes. However, Sharon, addressing the shadow as Dragon, asked what he wanted, and if he had something to talk about, then he should do it in person. With a slanted hat and a glowing, devilish eye, he started to emerge and instantly grew to the size of a human in no time. Changing to his real form, he straightened his hat and gave a grim smile as he apologized for his behavior and addressed him as Sharon Diprin, claiming how it had been a long time. Deep-seat Dragon, with a calm look and a smile on his face, looked at Sharon. As Salem got off the carriage, Deep-Sea Dragon's face instantly turned pale and sweat ran down him as he looked at Salem. Paying no attention to him, Salem walked forward, leading the way as Sharon and Dragon followed him. Meanwhile, Dragon, maintaining his posture, questioned in surprise, saying to think that Sharon would be together with Senior Salem. To which Salem asked him to shut up and further stated that his breath stinks. Meanwhile, Andreas, who was behind all of them, looked at them and wondered how Deep-Sea Dragon was probably trying to steal the page of Sloth but didn't expect us to be with Salem. Sharon then pointed his hand towards a direction and told everyone to look over there. Sharon then told everyone that Sir Morshi had noticed that they had arrived and was showing them the path to the congregation. To which Salem, in frustration, asked why he had to pick a place that was so high up. Abruptly, Salem's attention was diverted as he sensed something in the woods nearby. Immediately as he realized what it was, Salem, with a cunning smile, exclaimed how it was just as he expected. Out of nowhere, Salem started to walk forward and took a stance like something big was going to happen. Witnessing Salem's sudden alertness, everyone behind him were left in a state of shock as they could not comprehend what he was about to do. Looking at the congregation location in the dark forest, Salem grabbed his wand and told everyone that it seemed there were some pretty greedy black mages there. Hearing this, everyone behind him were surprised and yelled if those black mages were stupid enough to try and steal the Codex while Salem himself was there. Meanwhile, the black mages who were hiding in the forest were ready to launch their attacks. Watching Salem approach them, they immediately activated the multiple spells. Instantly, multiple black whips emerged from the ground beneath them, grabbing them one by one as they struggled to resist. The black whips had also caught Salem's legs, which restricted his movements. But to Salem, this was nothing more than mere child's play. So, with a furious look, he raised his wand above his head, prepared his spell, and was ready to see how many black mages there were. Instantly, he slammed his wand into the ground from where the black whips had appeared, and a huge burst of light emerged from the impact. The light was so powerful that it destroyed all the black whips that were grabbing Salem's legs. Immediately, the burst of light began to transform into a colorful magical aura and started to spread throughout the forest. This magical aura could not only destroy the black wipes, but also could detect the cores of every individual that were around there. The same magical aura started to appear in one of the black mages who was hiding in the forest, and as he sensed more magical cores of the black mages hiding in different directions of the forest. As the black whips that were grabbing Andreas, Sharon, and Dragon were destroyed, Salem, who was standing confidently, had also sensed the dantian of Andreas, who was standing behind him. Raising his wand, Salem exclaimed how there were only about 7 of them. With a devilish look, Salem claimed how he was done playing hide-and-seek with them and was ready to get them. As Salem leaped towards the black mages, a burst of light emerged from the spot he was standing, which left everyone around him startled. Instantly, as Salem leaped past the black mages in the front, one of them in a panic claimed that they had been found. As Salem passed through other black mages, all of them were stunned to see how fast he was. While one of them turned back towards her friend, screaming for everyone to retreat. Her eyes were left wide open in shock as she saw what was about to happen. Salem, who had reached all the black mages with a mocking grin on his face, was patiently preparing an attack. Instantly yelling, "Found you!" Salem, standing on the branch of a tree, launched his monstrous attack, aiming towards all the black mages that were present there. The attack was so powerful that it created a huge explosion, which could also be seen from the tower where the members of the congregation were present. Meanwhile, inside the tower, a mysterious person with purple hair was taking a sip from the cup in her hands and besides her was a woman who was sleeping in the chair as she leaned on another huge monster-like being who was also grabbing his cup. Another mysterious person was also present there, who wore a pointy hat and had glowing eyes who looked alert. Abruptly, the huge door that was right in front of the table that they were sitting on started to open slowly. As the door opened, Salem called for more she, stating how it had been a long time that they had not seen each other. Meanwhile, Sharon, who was behind Salem, bowed his head and greeted them by calling their names more she, Jester, and stated how it had been a while since they met. While Jester, wearing a pointy hat, exclaimed how even Salem himself had come. In response, Salem giggled, claiming that he didn't need to be that cold, as they should be thankful to him who kept the page of sloth safe and sound, further calling Andreas boy and ordering him to open the bag, to which Andreas calmly opened the bag and poured severed heads of the black mages that had tried to attack them. Members of the congregation were left in a state of shock. Everyone who was around there were confused to witness the commotion that had happened in front of them. Jester, who was standing up, responded how that was an emergency meeting where there were not many of them, and still he committed such an unnecessary murder. Meanwhile, Andreas, in the back of his mind, was wondering how those were all intermediary and higher-level black mages who were pretty annoying to deal with back in the game, and that Salem managed to deal with them just by releasing his magic power. He concluded that Isekai'd was truly a force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, Salem, with a puzzled look, claimed that without him there, they wouldn't even be able to get a glimpse of the sloth. Jester, trying to divert the topic, told him enough about the small fries, further ordering to hurry up and show him the page of sloth. Andreas glanced towards Sharon, to which Sharon nodded in agreement. Then Andreas reached out his hand to open a portal, while Salem, who was standing behind him, wondered how a brat like Andreas Cromwell was quite interesting, as he didn't even flinch after witnessing that massacre and didn't even hesitate when he was told to cut off their necks. But the thing that intrigued him the most was that Andreas had a dual core trait just like him, which he realized in the forest when he was using his detection spell. As Andreas was opening the portal, Salem slowly sneaked behind him while Sharon and Dragan stared at him in confusion. Instantly, as Salem reached behind Andreas, he blew air in the back of his neck. Agitated by his actions, Andreas turned towards him, asking what the hell he was doing. In response, Salem, with a joyful look, claimed that he had taken a liking to Andreas. Meanwhile, the one with the purple hair yelled at Salem, asking him what he was doing. Jester, agreeing to her, told him to stop with the jokes right there. But Salem, unbothered by all their comments, leaned towards Andreas and told him that he would definitely help Andreas out someday. But just once further, Salem said he could see that as a favor, as he had some affinity with the Cromwell family. Listening to Salem, Andreas looked at him in bewilderment as he questioned himself if he had just made a promise to him. Andreas knew that Salem was someone who never broke his promises, and even that there were numerous times in the game where he kept his promise, no matter what. So, considering all this, Andreas thought if he had Salem's help, he shouldn't change his plans a little. Instantly, the portal opened, and Nickel started to walk out from it. Nickel, as he walked forward, he held a page of sloth in his hands and showed it to everyone present. As the members of the congregation watched Nickel hold the page of sloth, they were certain that it truly was the real diligent sloth. At the same time, behind Nickel, Sharon stood in complete silence as he wondered when Andreas had summoned an undead. Meanwhile, Salem asked Andreas if he had really entrusted the Codex to a skeleton, to which Andreas agreed in response. Staring at the page of sloth in Nickel's hands, Salem exclaimed how Andreas's undead must be pretty durable then. Then Andreas glanced at Nickel and took a long breath as he closed his eyes and told himself to calm down. He knew that everyone present, there were monsters that were capable of killing him instantly. So he thought about how he didn't want to take any chances with those monsters. He then opened his eyes and with a look of determination told himself that he couldn't hesitate even once. Meanwhile, all the members of the congregation were discussing the page of sloth amongst themselves as they needed to decide on the best course of action. But to their surprise, in that very moment, Andreas slightly leaned towards Nickel and told him to go back. He then immediately grabbed his sword and quickly drew it out from his shed. The members of the congregation were left in shock as they turned towards Andreas and the page of sloth. But it was too late, as Nickel had almost completely returned back to his portal with the page of sloth. Salem stared at Andreas as he could not believe what he was doing. Not only Salem, but all the other members along with Sharon and Dragan were also surprised as they witnessed what was happening right in front of them. Andreas had held the sword and stabbed himself while looking at the members of the congregation. Meanwhile, Sharon and Dragan just stooped behind Andreas in bewilderment. Abruptly, Jester, calling Andreas Karen's disciple, asked him what he was doing. Andreas, who had stabbed himself between his bones and his chest, claimed that he was the one who found the Page of Sloth. Then, with a greedy look and bloody lips, Andreas smiled and stated that he wanted his efforts to be recognized appropriately. As the members of the congregation heard that, all of them got furious with his words and began to unleash their own powers. Simultaneously, Jester, who was staring at Andreas, claimed that he had gone mad with greed. Meanwhile, the purple-haired lady looked wary of his actions. Instantly, the purple-haired lady, whose name was Morshi, was startled as she was called by Andreas. Then Andreas, with blood dripping from his mouth, told Morshi that the Page of Sloth was in his storage along with his skeleton, and if he were to die, they would never be able to get their hands on the Codex. With the sword still stuck to his chest, Andreas could feel all the pain, but still called for Salem. Andreas then questioned Salem if he just a while ago said that he would help Andreas out one time, further pointing out that now was the time. As Andreas' wound kept getting worse, he told Salem to hurry up as he didn't have much time. In response, Salem asked him why Andreas was acting that reckless just because of something he said, and further questioned what Andreas would have done if he had just tricked him. Meanwhile, Andreas, who had almost lost all his energy, bent down in pain as he claimed that he would do the best he could even if it meant that he was going to die. Hearing all this, all the members of the congregation stared at Andreas in disbelief. As the whole commotion was happening, Andreas wondered that to survive in this crazy world, he must be willing to become crazy himself. Listening to Andreas, Salem made up his mind and responded to Andreas, stating how he really was a funny guy. Reminiscing their conversation earlier, Salem stated that he did tell Andreas to struggle, but he never expected him to go that far. Instantly, a bright green light started to emerge from Salem's wand, which left Morshi, along with everyone, stunned. The bright light then turned into multiple sinister lance evil serpents that immediately surrounded Andreas. Many evil serpents were being released by the wand in Salem's hand, while he proceeded to tell Andreas that if he insists. Then, with the most ferocious smile, Salem, the devil in disguise, claims, stating that he had no choice but to kill them all. Instantly, Salem raised his wand, which emitted a strange green mana with several serpents, and stated that from now on, anyone who tried to touch Andreas Cromwell would be killed. To which the member of the congregation, who was sleeping just a moment ago, blushed in excitement and said that they won't touch Andreas, while the huge monster-like member stood beside her in shock. Salem, with a cunning smile, continued if anyone dared to question this later, he would find and kill them. Listening to Salem, Jester, who was standing silently, asked Salem if he was really going to fight them over a kid like that, further questioning him if he was serious. In response, Salem just laughed and told Jester that he already knew what he was like, and that he wouldn't tell a lie like that. Frustrated by all this, the purple-hair lady sighed in anger as she asked Salem if he was joking with her. Furious at their words, Salem couldn't contain his anger. As his eyes turned red with fury, he questioned them if he really had to repeat himself again. As Salem threatened them, Jester and the purple-hair lady stood in silence as they stared at him. It was not just them. Sharon and Andreas also looked worried as they witnessed all this, while the other lady with white hair looked excited, along with a puzzled, huge, monstrous member who could not believe what Andreas and Salem were doing. Breaking the silence, Jester claimed it couldn't be helped, and turning towards Andreas, called him Karen's disciple and asked him what was that he wanted. Hearing Jester, everyone just stood in silence. Then Andreas, who was moaning in pain, decided to end his act and took out a healing potion. Then, after Andreas drank the potion, he dropped the bottle on the floor, which again caught the attention of everyone. As the potion started to heal his wounds, Andreas returned his sword back in his inventory and grabbed the chest where he had stabbed himself. With blood still dripping from his mouth, he glanced at the members and thanked everyone for waiting. Abruptly, Jester told Andreas to tell him what he wanted from them, to which Andreas, who looked confused, wiping the blood from his mouth, asked Jester if he could tell him what he could get for it. Surprised by Andreas' words, Jester pointed out how ridiculous it was, as he didn't even know what he wanted. So Jester raised his left hand and started to use his magic while telling Andreas to take 5 items from that list, further warning him to choose carefully. Instantly, a long scroll was summoned by Jester's magic, and showing the scroll to Andreas, he stated that there were also corpses in there too. Analyzing the scroll, Andreas thought in the back of his mind about the corpses Jester mentioned, further wondering how it was the congregation, so they must have some good corpses. Immediately, something caught his attention. It was none other than the corpse of the former fairy queen, Mylene, and the Tiger King Timer. He instantly knew they were first-class materials, and with his eyes wide open, Andreas decided that he must get them. Abruptly, the huge monstrous member called for Jester and told him that those corpses had already been sold to Morn, and if he gave them to Andreas, Morn would definitely be furious. While the white-haired girl jumped and grabbed the huge member in excitement. As Andreas heard the name Morn, he immediately recognized who it was. He then questioned himself if they were saying that those corpses had been bought by the leading figure of necromancy, which made him wary as he thought if he messed with him, things would get problematic, and decided to give up on them. Out of nowhere, a voice echoed, stating how he didn't mind and that Andreas could take the corpses. Andreas, who was stunned as he heard the voice, instantly recognized who it was and stared at the direction from where the voice came. Not only Andreas, but everyone present there were also stunned to hear the voice of Morn and turned back towards the direction, while Salem smiled and wondered how generous it was of him. It was now obvious that the voice was none other than Morn, who had been monitoring all this with a small undead fly. Immediately Sharon, who was behind Andreas watching all this with a puzzled look, called the Fly Master. Bewildered by the whole situation, Sharon further yelled, stating how Andreas didn't have the ability to handle those corpses yet. In response, the Fly, calling Sharon, pointed out that he said he didn't mind. Then calling for Andreas, the Fly said that the corpses were in his subspace bag and told him to take the whole bag with him. Meanwhile, the white hair member leaned close to the small Fly with curiosity. Hearing Morn say all this through the Fly shocked Andreas, leaving his two stunned to respond immediately, while Salem, standing beside Andreas, thought how Andreas had earned it. Andreas, with a worried look, couldn't comprehend why Morn was being so generous, but still knew that he couldn't let that opportunity pass. Bowing his head, Andreas claimed how grateful he was for Sir Morn's generosity and stated how he would now be selecting the rest of the items, including the corpses. Meanwhile, Sharon bit his lips in frustration as he wondered how he should have brought the Page of Sloth there by himself. In just a few moments, Andreas told the names of all the items he needed, and Jester instantly gave all of them to him. The items he chose were Moon's Blessing, Blue Canangulus Flowers, Yobin's Roots, Fairy's Tears, Kidanon's Jewel, Fairy Queen Millie's Corpse, and Timer's Corpse. Looking at the items Andreas chose, Salem called Andreas Kid and told him that there were better things in there and questioned him if he was really sure he wanted those, to which Andreas, who was packing the items, responded, stating for him, those were very valuable. As Andreas finished his packing, he wondered how he could make a total of 4 potions with these items, and that they were worth several 100 million wills. Then he was satisfied as he thought about how he ended up picking out ingredients for Lucia's cure too. Jester, who was patiently waiting, told Andreas to hand over the Page of Sloth now to him. Responding affirmatively, Andreas then proceeded to open his portal to take the Page of Sloth out, while Dragan, who was standing behind Andreas, looked intently at the portal opening. Andreas then passed the Page of Sloth to them, while Jester with his magic made the Page of Sloth float towards him. Abruptly, Salem sneaked behind Andreas as he passed the Page of Sloth and told him to get ready to go immediately, to which Andreas, hearing all, could only stand in surprise. Immediately after Andreas passed the Page of Sloth, Salem launched his attack at the walls of the tower and grabbed Andreas by his robe and dashed out of the tower. Everyone who witnessed this were startled as they watched Salem leap out of the hole he created and yelled at others to go after them. Meanwhile, Andreas, with a look of bewilderment, held his bag tightly as Salem dragged him as he flew away, watching the tower. As they were flying away, Andreas stated that they were planning to get rid of him once he gave them the Page of Sloth, to which Salem agreed, stating, correct, and glanced towards Andreas. He proceeded, saying, a promise is a promise, and that he would take him to a safe place, further asking Andreas where he wanted him to take him. Glancing back at Salem, Andreas said he would like to go back to the academy and requested him to take him to the nearest train station. As they flew past the forest, Salem with a surprised tone asked, the Rodland Academy, to which Andreas agreed. Instantly, Salem questioned Andreas if Bart knew he was a black mage. With a surprised look, Andreas glanced back at Salem and sarcastically questioned if he knew, then he wouldn't have been alive, would he? Agreeing to Andreas, Salem exclaimed how fate is a curious thing, and further stated that he would figure everything out when the time comes. Meanwhile, Andreas, trying to comprehend what Salem just said, asked what on earth he was talking about. Salem replied, stating as he told him earlier on their way there, just keep struggling as long as you can survive. Then Andreas will definitely find out who he is. Soon, Andreas reached his dormitory. As they slowly took out the items they received from the congregation, the first one was the former Fairy Queen Mylene's corpse. Struggling and gasping for breath, the other one was the Tiger King Timer's corpse. Taking deep, long breaths, Andreas told how something this big could fit into it, claiming the subspace bag was really handy. Raising both of his hands, he cast a spell opening his portals and started to wonder how he had no choice but to summon Nickel as a skeleton. But for these two, it would be better to increase his necromancy levels and turn them into high-level summons. But for now, he would keep them inside his portals. Both of them glanced at the final item that was left in the bag. Then Andreas said, and now, and picked it up wondering a book. Suddenly, a notification popped up stating it was Morn's Black Magic Tome, a high-level skill book written personally by Morn. As he opened the book, he was so shocked that he questioned himself if it was a gift from Morn. As he continued reading, he realized the book contained a lot of knowledge that he couldn't get at Karen's library, and if he were to read this, he would be able to turn the corpses he got today into high-level summons. Suddenly, something caught his attention. As he turned back thinking what it was, a notification popped up above Nickel stating Skeleton Soldier Legendary's evolution probability was 100%, and there were 66 possible divergences of evolution, and if he wanted to evolve it. Looking at Nickel, he thought how he was wondering when he would be able to evolve him, but it seemed like the time had finally come. The fact that the status window appeared right after he gave the page of sloth away, and it looked like the Codex had an effect on the evolution, but worrying about it won't give him any answers, so there was no point thinking about it, and it said 100%, so he decided to evolve it first. Then he clicked on the yes button. Suddenly, Nickel thought he was about to feel the surge of power. But he didn't feel what he thought he would feel, and looked at both his hands as he clenched them, trying to feel the power. Meanwhile, the status window showed that the evolving rate was 0.1% completed. Andreas, in the back of his mind, wondered how Nickel didn't seem to suffer like a vampire, and maybe it was because he was an undead. Suddenly, he was interrupted by someone knocking on the door. He instantly opened the portal for Nickel to get in and ran towards the door walking, who it was while Nickel was peeking through the portal wondering who it might be. It was Lucia Everlast who addressed Andreas as senior, and asked him if he had a moment, to which Andreas exclaimed, Lucia. Meanwhile, inside Morn's castle, Salem and Morn were sitting across from each other. Salem addressed him as Gramps Morn and asked if he could ask him something, to which Morn gave him permission to ask. Salem questioned the reason Morn gave him the information about the sloth was because he needed someone to protect Andreas, and further asked if he was right, to which Morn stayed completely silent and took a sip from his cup of tea. As he nervously laughed, he questioned if that was a yes, further stating how he took such good care of Cain and even his son too, but soon disagreed with himself and questioned how he was forced onto Morn by the Empire, and it was hard to teach him because he had no talent. After hearing him, Morn broke his silence and abruptly addressed Salem, asking if he knew the origin of necromancy, to which Salem, with a confused look, asked why the sudden question. Reminiscing the tales told by the old folks, there was a beautiful lady and a mage. As time passed, they deeply fell in love with each other and promised to be together forever. However, their promise couldn't be fulfilled as the lady died, and the mage invented necromancy in the pursuit of immortality. But, more precisely, necromancy is the pursuit of immortality for those you love. It was born of the obsession to keep the loved ones with you forever. Hearing all this, Salem was left in a state of confusion and stated how it was an old man's tale, to which Morn replied, maybe. Throwing the book on the table, Salem questioned if he wasn't also a sage and that he should have understood what he was saying. Hearing what Salem just said, Morn laughed as he said to Salem, leaving it to my imagination, huh? With a cunning look on his eyes, he stated how it looked like Morn had got another tie to the Cromwell family, besides that Cain. As he laid back on his chair, he confidently claimed that even if he forced Morn, he wouldn't answer him, so he gave up. Meanwhile, Morn diverted the situation by asking about Andreas, claiming he was curious to know what he thought about him. With an annoyed look, he shouted that he knew he saw everything using that zombie bug to snoop around them, which made Morn laugh nervously as he realized he had been caught. With a grim smile, Salem told Morn that he would tell him this much and reminisced about the time how Andreas used his own life to threaten the congregation, and stated that kid is going to be the most insane person in this world, even crazier than him, to which Morn, containing his excitement, claimed he was looking forward to it. Meanwhile, moving his hand forward with a pleased look on his face, he introduced himself as William Everlast Hollington. Shaking his hand back, he introduced himself as Andreas Cromwell, to which William, holding an envelope, welcomed him and asked to have a seat while Lucia stood beside them. As they were all sitting in the hall, William, opening the envelope, apologized for having Andreas to come all the way there just for the initial settlement of the potion profits, and how he just wanted to talk to Andreas in person since they were going to be working together from now on. With a big smile on his face, he sarcastically stated that he had become a close friend of Lucia as well. Meanwhile, hearing this, Lucia glanced at her father with a look of embarrassment. Andreas, with a pleased look on his face, replied that he had also been looking forward to meeting him and was grateful for all the help his daughter had given him and also for providing him with such a good deal. As William pulled out the documents from the envelope, he stated that he was the producer, further crediting that he was entitled to at least that much. Meanwhile, Lucia, being the proud woman she is, commented how Andreas should be grateful as she was the one who made sure that he got a good deal. Handing the documents to Andreas, William told him to take a look. As he was reading through the documents, he realized he would get 60% of the profits, and each one was worth 3 million wills, so the final amount that he would get was over 1.8 billion. Andreas was shocked as he realized that he had already earned that much money, and over 1,000 were sold in just a month. William explained how the potions were selling like hotcakes, further assuring Andreas that the next sum he will receive will be much bigger. Hearing this, Andreas, with an intrigued look, kept on reading the documents. Standing up, William smiled with joy and stated it was enough talk about business, further suggesting that they should have dinner, and since this was the first time Lucia had brought a friend, he was looking forward to hearing their stories, and in a joking way, he stated it was a boy she had brought home, to which Andreas stared at him with a look of embarrassment. A month had passed by. As Andreas boarded the train, he was thankful to the word of mouth, due to which the Everlast potion had become very popular. And not just for combat, but it was also taking high society circles by storm. Moreover, to increase production, the trading company decided to expand its suppliers and production facilities. Andreas, looking at his tablet, was still surprised as he never thought they would sell over 2,000 units in a month. If he had known this was going to happen, then he would have bought the tablet sooner. Reminiscing about the potions and the contract he had signed, he honestly didn't think that he could make so much money from the potion alone, and he had received plenty of letters showing support from the nobility, and it was all thanks to the potion's popularity. Looking outside the window, he thought to himself how he had 6 billion wills on him at the moment, and the Cromwell's estate is worth 3.5 billion, including the handling fees. As he reached out to grab his bag, he stared into it and wondered even if he bought it back, he would still have plenty of money to spare. As he reached his destination, Hartwell Station of the National Cemetery, he stood up, grabbed his bag, and got out of the train. With a determined look on his face, he thought that the first thing he had to do was to get the signet ring back. Soon, he reached his destination, the National Cemetery. He went inside the cemetery and made his way towards the house where Paimon lived. Paimon was there, but he was not alone. He was talking to a mysterious masked man who was standing beside him, which made Andreas curious as to who the mysterious masked man standing next to Paimon was. As Andreas reached near them, Paimon welcomed him, suggesting they should go inside and have some tea. Staring at the masked man, Andreas questioned who was the person standing next to him. With a cunning look, Paimon glanced back at the masked man, stating he invited him to be the guarantor as he thought it might be necessary in order to avoid any problems later. As Paimon insisted that they should get inside first, soon they all started to make their way inside the house. After they entered the house, Paimon and Andreas sat across the table, and the masked man was standing between them. While Paimon was pouring tea for them, Andreas, with a displeased look, stared at the masked man, wondering how it was a blatant lie that a guarantor was holding a sword and hiding his face. However, he knew Paimon had been practicing necromancy there for a long time, but he was no better than Sharon back in the game. He was just a small fry. Remembering how much he has evolved and gained a variety of skills compared to the last time he was there, he was confident that Paimon was no match for him at that moment. Evolved Nickel can also use aura, so unless it was against someone at the aura master level, Nickel can't be beaten. The only issue was how strong the masked guy was. He wondered if he should have released the energy in his Danteon. He thought holding back just before that would be enough, but now he was not so sure. Passing a cup of tea to Andreas, Paimon exclaimed that he had ordered the tea from a guy he knew in the congregation, and it's pretty good. Losing his patience, he gasped as he got right to the point, further stating that he would like to talk about the signet ring rather than the tea. Hearing this, Paimon, with a look of annoyance, accused Andreas for being so impatient. With confidence in his eyes, Andreas continued, saying that the corpse he bought from Paimon was mediocre, but since he had been so accommodating, he was willing to give him 5 million wills in exchange. Paimon was left in a state of bewilderment, as he couldn't comprehend how a person like Andreas was confidently offering such a large amount. Instantly, he gave a grim smile, stating how Andreas had become so great without him noticing and generous, as well, further claiming despite being rotten, he was in fact still a count. Andreas knew it wouldn't be that easy, and a sly person like Paimon wouldn't agree to him. So he smiled and sighed without breaking a word. With a cunning look, Paimon stated how the offer Andreas made was a tad harsh, as the price of secrecy isn't that cheap. Glancing at Paimon, thinking how it was so typical of a villain like him, he further asked if Paimon was saying that he should pay more. With a cunning look, he smiled and pointed at Andreas's bag, telling him not to worry, and that he meant to trade it for the stuff he got at the congregation. As Andreas glanced at his bag, Paimon, staring at the bag, continued saying that he heard Andreas got a lot of stuff, and all he had to do was give some of it to him. Giving a devilish smile, Paimon asked Andreas how the deal was and stated how it was not a bad one for him. Andreas, comprehending what Paimon just said, closed his eyes and took a sip from his cup of tea. Instantly, Andreas smiled with confidence and said he appreciated the offer, which made both Paimon and his guarantor left in a state of confusion. Putting his cup down on the table, Andreas said that he wanted everything to be clear, to which Paimon stared at him with an intrigued look. Andreas confidently took his stand and said 5 million wills and no more than that. Trying to control his anger, his eyes turned bloody red as he addressed Andreas as brat, stating that he didn't sound like he got what Paimon was saying. Denying what Paimon just said, Andreas claimed he knew exactly what he meant. With a grim smile, he told how he knew that Paimon never intended to make a fair deal in the first place. As Paimon realized how his plan had failed, he tightly grasped the edge of the table and stayed still in complete silence. Meanwhile, the masked man who stood beside Paimon, unsheathing his sword, claimed that they were done there, to which Paimon glanced at him, giving him permission. With confidence in his eyes, he gave a grim smile as he raised his hand up and agreed with the masked man, stating he was getting a little tired of all these charades, while summoning a portal out of which Nickel came out holding his sword, preparing for battle. Paimon and the masked man were both amazed to witness this commotion, while Andreas continued, stating he had just one question. With glowing red eyes and steam coming out his mouth as he breathed, it was Nickel Lifehill, a sloth phantom legendary, an undead of tier 5 with the traits of self-awareness, with sword as his mastery, and a spectral form of sloth, came completely out of the portal, maintaining his fighting stance. With a grim smile, he confidently questioned if he really thought they could beat him. Hearing what Andreas just said, Paimon, with a look of frustration, wondered how a brat like Andreas could threaten him like this. Instantly, he stood up with a displeased look on his face and told the masked man that he would throw in extra money on top of what he had promised, to which the masked man maintained his fighting stance. Clenching his teeth in anger, he furiously ordered the masked man to kill Andreas right away. Suddenly, the masked man glanced back as he noticed something. It was none other than Nickel, who had swiftly sprinted behind Paimon, preparing to launch an attack. Meanwhile, he had no idea about the swift attack and was telling the masked man to take Andreas' stuff. Out of nowhere, the masked man threw his robe and quickly jumped on the table in front of Paimon, blocking Nickel's furious attack, creating sparkles as two swords clashed with each other. Paimon was both shocked and confused to witness Nickel attack him from behind. As the masked man's robe flew towards him, Andreas stayed still in complete silence, witnessing everything that was happening. Suddenly, he noticed something. It was sticky bombs that were planted on the robe that the masked man threw. Keeping his calm, Andreas quickly unsheathed his sword, thinking how he used to use those a lot in the game. While he swiftly cut down the bombs with several slashes from his sword, in the back of his mind, he thought how not only did the masked man stop Nickel, but he also kept Andreas in check, so he was no ordinary man. The battle between the masked man and Nickel was so fierce that sparks flew across the room and loud clashing sounds could be heard when their swords clashed onto each other. Meanwhile, Andreas was intrigued and couldn't help but watch such a fearsome battle. Abruptly, the masked man drew back his hand, aiming at Nickel to swing the sword at him, while Nickel, keeping his calm, carefully watched the masked man's moves, trying to comprehend how he should tackle his move. Instantly, the masked man jumped towards Nickel, launching a swift straight attack on Nickel, aiming for his head. However, Nickel, being an aura master, quickly managed to dodge the fatal attack. But, to his surprise, he got a small cut on his cheek. However, it was nothing for him as he continued looking for the masked man's weakness to launch a counterattack. Suddenly, Nickel quickly grabbed one of the legs of the masked man. With a confused look, he looked down towards his leg, but all of a sudden, Nickel pulled his leg, throwing him up in the air and preparing his sword to launch a mid-air attack. Using one of his hands, Nickel started to imbue aura into his sword, making it glow brightly, emitting immense aura from it. As he braced himself in a fighting stance to launch a fierce attack on the masked man, who was in mid-air and totally confused as to how a mere undead skeleton could do such a thing. Instantly, Nickel furiously launched his attacks on the masked man. The attack was so fierce that loud crashing noises and sparks flew all over the room as the swords clashed with each other. However, Andreas, witnessing the fight, was left in a state of shock as he wondered how Nickel imbued his sword with an aura. Looking at Nickel holding his aura-imbued sword, Andreas thought how after evolving and gaining a Danteon, it was not surprising to see that Nickel could also use aura, but Looking at the masked man who was unharmed, with an intrigued look on his face, he questioned himself if the enemy was really that tough. Looking at how the masked man could fight toe-to-toe with Nickel, who was an evolved Aura Master, he was left in a state of confusion as he glanced at the masked man and asked himself who the hell he was. All of a sudden, the masked man vanished instantly, which left Andreas question not only about his strength and intelligence, but also his speed, which was amazingly fast. Abruptly, the masked man and Nickel leaped onto each other, taking multiple fierce swings onto each other. The battle was so fierce that the echoes of their swords clashing into each other could be heard as sparks flew across the room when their swords clashed. But the masked man had taken his toll. He was no match for Nickel, who successfully managed to harm him with several deep cuts on different parts of his body. However, Nickel was still offensive and took a big jump towards the masked man, planning to take a huge swing at him and ending the fight. But the masked man was not one to fall in despair and charged at Nickel with all his might and managed to strike through his forehead, piercing his skull. He thought he had finally managed to defeat Nickel, but was surprised to witness something in front of him. It was Nickel, but he had transformed in a soul-like form and looked as if the masked man's swing did not affect him at all. He turned invincible as any physical attack wouldn't affect him. The masked man was both confused and shocked as he thought he had got Nickel finally, but had failed. As Nickel came flying towards him, he panicked and was trying to evade Nickel's attack, but to his surprise, he was struck on his jaw by Nickel, who landed a powerful blow by his knee by slowly transforming partially from his soul form to his real physical form, leaving the masked man sent flying, destroying the table and window, while Nickel was in mid-air after launching the attack and Andreas stayed beside him watching the masked man sent flying. Andreas continued gazing at the masked man. However, Nickel was left in a state of confusion and shock as he witnessed the masked man trying to get up on his knees, but was instantly being pulled inside by several hands from the portal that Paimon had summoned. With mana on his hand, he glanced at the masked man addressing him as Dan, further asking what he was doing. With anger in his eyes and mana in his hand, he yelled at Dan, stating if he wanted the money, then he should start pushing himself harder. Meanwhile, witnessing everything, Andreas had a troubled look on his face as he wondered how Paimon had summoned the undeads while he was distracted. With a confused and intrigued look, he stared at Nickel and opened portals to summon his own undead warriors, claiming how Nickel, who fought bravely, must be a phantom. As undead started to walk out of the portal, Paimon, with anger filled at his eyes, exclaimed how it looked like Andreas managed to get a nice corpse from the congregation. As the sheer number of undead summoned by Paimon started to come out of the portal, he challenged Andreas to see how long he could last against his finest warriors. Suddenly, hands started to appear from under the ground. Cracks on the ground started to form simultaneously. As Paimon warned Andreas to not forget that they were standing on top of a mountain of corpses, soon a large number of undead corpses stood up, waking from their eternal sleep, marching towards Andreas and Nickel. Realizing that they had been completely surrounded, they had a troubled look as it was just the two of them, so Andreas advised Nickel to split up for now, and when the moment was right, they would take Paimon's back. After that, they both parted their ways and flew in the opposite direction. Andreas dashed outside the house, kicking and breaking the window, while Paimon's undead maintained their fighting stance, preparing to attack Andreas. However, Andreas was not the same weak guy as before. He had been training rigorously, honing his skills, stamina, and strength. He swiftly dashed past the undeads, easily slashing and beheading everyone that came his way. His speed and slashes were so powerful that several body parts of the undeads were flying midway in the air by his attacks. As he glanced to his right, the sheer number of undeads charging towards him made him draw to the conclusion that a sword fight won't be enough for them, and swung his sword up and counterattacked with his Earth Shield, attack where giant rocks appeared and crushed the undead soldiers, scattering bits and pieces of the undead soldiers. But it wasn't going to be enough. As he glanced back, he could see more undeads marching towards him. They felt no pain and were so relentless that even after having half of its body crushed, it was still coming towards him. With eyes filled with anger, he glanced towards the undeads, wondering how there was no end to them. Then he clenched his finger, and the rocks he just used to crush the undead started to float and break into chunks of rocks. Sharpening it using his earth magic, he yelled stone spears and launched several spear-shaped rocks, piercing the bodies of the undeads. He swiftly swung his sword, beheading one of the undead, while the other undead was watching in fear and despair. Suddenly, several undead archers were aiming at Andreas and launched their arrows towards him. Despite being caught up against such a sheer number of undeads, Andreas had already noticed the archers as well and quickly cut and deflected the arrows aimed at him. Not only that, he even cut off a hand of one of the undead and beheaded another one who had come near to him to attack. He He then maintained his composure and dashed forward, defeating the archers and several other undeads. His attacks were so fierce and fast that undeads and their weapons were flying midway in the air. Watching Andreas create such havoc, Paimon cursed the undead, stating how they were only useless bunches, claiming they could not even defeat just one kid. Suddenly, something caught his attention. As he glanced back to see what it was, he had a nervous look as he witnessed it was Dan who had come to his rescue and was blocking a surprise sneak attack from Nickel. The level of aura emanating from their sword clash was so intense. Nickel had truly evolved to a whole different level. The aura emanating from Nickel's sword was so overwhelming that it started to take a toll on Dan's sword, so he cursed Nickel for being such a powerful opponent despite being an undead. As Nickel stared down on Dan with glowing red eyes, a sticky bomb that was lit popped out of Nickel's robe. All of a sudden, a huge explosion was caused by the sticky bomb planted on Nickel. Dan had been tricked with his own little trick, and it costed his life. Meanwhile, Andreas, with all his might, was fighting the undeads alone and slashing each and every one of them who came in his way. Even though he didn't even have the time to use the recovery potion, he was still cutting down his foes. Thinking how at this rate, things could get really bad for him, he jumped and braced himself to launch yet another attack and swiftly attacked the undeads, cutting them. But his body had started to take a toll. He was gasping for air, but there was no end to the undeads. Suddenly, he pierced through one of the undeads who had come very close to attack him and wondered where Nickel was. Meanwhile, several other undeads marched their way towards Andreas carrying different types of weapons. He was even using his bare hands to destroy the undeads, but he got a sensation that his whole body was going numb. It was as if every muscle in his body was being torn apart. Abruptly, one of the undead was unusual. It launched an acid attack from his mouth, but Andreas used his robe to save himself from it and wondered what kind of creature it was to launch such an attack. Several holes had occurred due to the acid attack of the undead. Glancing at the undead, he prepared his sword and swiftly beheaded the undead, wondering if he could even hold on until Nickel was back. Suddenly, something caught his attention. He was left in a state of bewilderment. As he looked up, it was an undead carrying a huge axe in his hand, aiming it towards Andreas. The undead quickly launched an attack, but Andreas managed to block it using his sword. Several sparks flew off as the sword and axe clashed. Seeing Andreas trying to withstand the undead with the axe, the other undeads also marched their way towards him, trying to take advantage. Instantly, Andreas kicked the undead on his jaw and kicked his giant axe off of his hand. The kick that Andreas gave in such a state wasn't powerful enough to affect him. Soon the undead rose his head up and stared at Andreas with a look of contempt. Andreas was getting weaker and weaker as he didn't even have time to consume potion to recover himself. Abruptly, the skeleton headbutt Andreas with immense force. Bearing such a powerful headbutt in such a weak state took a toll on Andreas. He got on top of Andreas and started to punch him rigorously, throwing punches after punches. There was nothing he could do than take the punches the undead was throwing. He wondered if he was going to die there, and that too at the hands of a mere skeleton knight. But if he were to die there, what would happen to Amy? What about Lucius's illness? And Vivian? He thought about how he finally had a reason to live. Blood dripped from his nose and teeth as he grinned with anger and yelled. He couldn't die like this. A bright crimson light started to shine from inside him. A system window popped up and stated, through continuous training, talent, and fierce combat, Aura had been awakened. As he looked down on his body, he could feel the surge of mana flowing inside him. Meanwhile, another window popped up stating Danteon had been activated and Aura could now be used. Due to the dual core trait, both mana and aura could now be used simultaneously. Then, all of a sudden, Andreas held his sword with a tight grip and cut off the undead that was thrashing with a single blow, yelling, "He's going back to where he belonged." As the shattered bones fell on his face, he was dripping blood from his nostril and mouth as he opened his eyes with a sense of accomplishment. Suddenly, a system window popped up stating an achievement, Second Awakening, had been achieved. Andreas, after his second awakening, slowly stood up and walked on the grass where all the remains of the undead were scattered. Andreas, with blood dripping from his face, grabbed his wounded hand and wondered how this battle was more troublesome than what he had previously thought. But looking at Nickel pointing his sword at Paimon, he knew that he had finally caught him and now could finally get his hands on his ring. Immediately, Andreas looked at Paimon and asked him where the ring was. Meanwhile, Paimon was scared for his life because of the sword that was pointed at him. Turning towards Andreas with a worried look, Paimon suggested he should put the sword away first, and only then could they talk, further telling Andreas to think about it. Then Paimon, pointing at the dead body of his partner, told them that with one of them dead, they could now negotiate a better deal. Meanwhile, Andreas glanced at the decapitated body. Andreas then slowly walked towards the decapitated body, and as he got closer to it, he stopped and started to look at the sword that was beside the body. As he looked at the sword, Andreas, in the back of his mind, wondered about what's to happen and thought what he should do now would be to use that guy's sword, as it might be better that way, and then grab the sword. With two swords in both hands, Andreas walked towards Paimon and again asked him where the ring was, to which Paimon could only stare at Andreas in bewilderment. With sweat dripping from his face, Paimon, looking at Andreas approaching him, yelled at him to wait and take it easy, but Andreas had lost all his patience and instantly slashed Paimon's right. The slash that Andreas sent was so fast that it instantly chopped off Paimon's hand, while all Paimon could do was scream in pain. As Paimon's hand fell on the grass, blood splashed from his arm, leaving him in extreme pain. Meanwhile, Andreas looked unbothered and cold as he swung the sword. Paimon instantly kneeled on the ground, shaking in pain, while Andreas threatened him to start talking, as he did not have any interest in discussing that with Paimon any longer. Having no choice, Paimon confessed, stating that the ring was in the cupboard in the bottom drawer of the cupboard in the house. Andreas, listening to Paimon moan in pain, stared at him as he had finally got the answer he was looking for. But then Paimon started to cough so uncontrollably that he spat blood from his mouth. Looking at his state, Andreas questioned to himself what was happening to him. Paimon was in immense pain as the veins on his head looked like they were going to pop at any moment, as he grabbed his own neck trying to stop his coughing, but failed miserably as the blood did not stop. Immediately, Paimon fell to the ground, struggling and screaming in pain, while Andreas still looked at him in confusion. Instantly, he stopped moving, and it was evident that now Paimon was dead. Andreas then wondered how he was planning to get rid of Paimon eventually, but looking at the sword in his right hand, he figured out that the sword was poisoned. Glancing at the decapitated swordsman, Andreas wondered who that guy was, as he was a skilled swordsman with a poisoned sword. Reminiscing to the time when he was summoned by Paimon, Andreas remembered how Paimon called the masked swordsman Dan, and as he tried to figure out who Dan was, a name popped in his head, so he questioned if that was Bloody Dan. To confirm his suspicions, Andreas bent down and reached towards the mask, as he thought if it really was him, then he knew that there was more to that mask. Immediately, as he took the mask, it looked as if the appearance changed, which further confirmed all of Andreas' suspicions about the mask. So then he put the mask on his face to see if what he thought was true. Out of nowhere, a blue light covered Andreas, and magical changed his appearance and his clothes to look like the swordsman from earlier. Then, taking the mask off, Andreas thought how Paimon had an appearance-altering mask artifact. Meanwhile, Nickel, standing behind Andreas, was looking at him in surprise as Andreas analyzed the mask. As all of his suspicions were confirmed, Andreas claimed how that guy was Bloody Dan, the one who started the war back in the game. And that later in the game, he would be hired to kidnap the Northern Barbarian Chief's child, which was the trigger that started a major war between the North and the Empire. Originally, the war would have spread throughout the whole continent, and Andreas would be dragging into it, but now witnessing all that happened, Andreas thought how it looked like he unexpectedly prevented it. Furthermore, Andreas knew that Bloody Dan was not the sort of character who was going to live out his life anyway. So he thanked him for the mask, and calling him Bloody Dan, told him that he would put it to good use. Turning towards Nickel, Andreas told him to go look for the ring and that he would clean up the mess there. After all the commotion had ended, Andreas went back to the academy and went to the Alvin Streets clinic to get his wounds treated. As Andreas was scrolling through the tablet to check the news about last night's incident, he came across an article that pointed out how black mages could be right next to you. The article further pointed out the terror that had happened in the National Cemetery, where Paimon the Necromancer and his hired sword fought over gold, killing each other. Meanwhile, Andreas, who had been patched up with bandages that covered most of his body, thought how it looked like he wouldn't be affected by that. Then, as Andreas clicked more on the tablet, he thought how it was time for him to take care of the most important stuff and began to search for something in his tablet. It was none other than their family home that they had lost. In the screen of the tablet, the house could be seen along with the price of the house, that was 2.5 billion. Andreas, without hesitating, instantly pressed the button to pay the price, and a notification stating how 2.5 billion, while including fees and taxes, had been paid. Andreas then took a sigh of relief and wondered how Amy would react, but abruptly, his thoughts were interrupted as someone from behind him reached their hand towards him and closed his eyes, asking him to guess who it was. It was none other than Lucia, who blushed as she closed Andreas' eyes, but to her surprise, Andreas did not utter a single word. Both of them stood there in complete silence. Then Lucia stood still for a few moments, but later gave up and walked beside Andreas, telling him how he was no fun, to which Andreas just calmly addressed her with a yo. Lucia, looking at Andreas, placed a basket full of fruits and questioned what the curt reaction on his face was, even though his cute junior came to visit him. In response, Andreas, with a slight smile, acknowledged Lucia's presence and thanked her. Hearing Andreas thank her, Lucia started to mock him, repeating the words he said, while Andreas, with an annoyed look, wondered in his mind what he was supposed to say. Lucia then asked Andreas what actually happened to him, to which Andreas wondered what he should tell her. Instantly avoiding Lucia's gaze, Andreas looked the other way and told her it was nothing and that he just overdid his training a bit. Meanwhile, in the back of his mind, he wondered about his dead training buddies from yesterday. Lucia then responded by telling him if he kept that up, he would die one day, but suddenly out of nowhere the door to his room was pushed open, leaving them puzzled as to who it was. It was Vivian, who rushed inside the door. As Vivian entered the room, she looked straight ahead, searching for someone. Vivian then turned around and glanced towards Andreas, to which Lucia stood silently, and Andreas, in surprise, wondered what Vivian was doing there. Vivian, looking at Andreas, stood in complete silence as she saw Andreas covered in bandages. Not only her, but Andreas and Lucia also silently stared at Vivian in confusion. Abruptly, the expression on Vivian's face changed, and with her eyes wide open, she wondered what had happened to Mr. Fairy. Vivian could no longer maintain her composure and instantly ran towards Andreas. Vivian then ran past Lucia, who just stood in complete bewilderment staring at Vivian. Reaching Andreas, Vivian grabbed and hugged him. Witnessing this, Andreas was left baffled as he could not understand why she just ran and hugged him. Meanwhile, Vivian kept bending her head towards Andreas' body and told him that she was worried about him. Andreas finally understood Vivian's feelings, and with a slight smile kept looking at Vivian in amazement. Meanwhile, Lucia, who had been standing silently, looked at Vivian and Andreas with a cold look. Andreas then told Vivian that he was all right. Lucia still could not understand the relation Andreas and Vivian had and just kept silently looking at them. And just like that, it took a week for Andreas to fully recover. After his recovery, Andreas, in a white carriage, went to the place he wanted to go for a long time. Inside the carriage, Andreas sat silently reading his book, while his sister Amy was also sitting opposite to him, wondering how Andreas said he wanted to show him something and questioned what could be. With a worried look, Amy continued to wonder how she went with him, because he said he got the ring back, but with concern asked to herself where he was taking her with all the curtains closed. Furthermore, Amy, looking at Andreas, was confused about how Andreas could afford that fancy carriage. Out of nowhere, the carriage driver called Andreas sir and told him that they had arrived at their destination, to which Andreas slammed the book he was reading. Amy then called Andreas' big brother and asked him where they were and further questioned him what it was that he wanted to show her. In response, Andreas told her that she would see everything when she got off the carriage. Out of nowhere, a voice startled Amy, and as she tried to recognize it, the voice stated how Andreas was right and that she would know it as soon as she got off the carriage. Instantly, the door of the carriage was opened by a lady with glasses who was wearing a maid dress. She then called her Lady Amy and welcomed her back. Amy instantly recognized the maid and in surprise yelled, calling her Lupin, and questioned Andreas what was going on and why was Lupin there. In response, Andreas simply told her that he asked her to work as their head maid again. With a concerned and worried look, Amy glanced at Andreas, calling him big brother, and told him how he knew that they couldn't afford that right now. Then she instantly grabbed Lupin's hand and started to apologize, stating how her brother was still naive about how things worked, while Andreas, who was silently sitting, slightly smiled. As Amy was apologizing to Lupin, her gaze turned towards what was in front of them this whole time. She then immediately took a step out of the carriage. Lupin then held Amy's hand as she got off the carriage with her eyes wide open, shocked with where they were. As Amy got off the carriage, she started to walk ahead, looking at their old home where they were born and raised by their family. Amy then, with a look of surprise, glanced at the castle in amazement and called its name Apple Wolf Mansion. After all, it was their own home. A home that was once filled with laughter and happiness. Standing there, all she could do was remember the happy times about their past, along with their father and Andreas as a kid. After reminiscing for a while, Amy then tired back and glanced behind her and asked why he brought her here. In response, Lapinia just handed her an envelope and told her to read that. While passing the envelope, Lupin just smiled, looking at the expression on Amy's face as she saw the mansion. Immediately, Amy read the document that was in the envelope and asked if it really was true. With sweat dripping from her face and eyes wide open, Amy asked if he bought their home back, further questioning him how. Instantly, Amy, baffled with the whole situation, asked if Andreas bought their home back by doing something bad, while Andreas took out his tablet and was ready to show her something. Turning the tablet towards Amy, Andreas told her that he invented a potion. Meanwhile, Amy just stared at the tablet to see what was in there. It was an article about Andreas and Lucia and how they invented the point together. As Amy read the article, Andreas stated how that was the reason that allowed him to buy their mansion back. Furthermore, Andreas told her that she didn't need to work so hard anymore, and that from now on, he would make sure that there was money on her card every month. Listening to everything Andreas just said, Amy was left speechless as she processed everything. Then Amy looked down on the ground as guilt filled her as she remembered about how, without knowing all that, even though Andreas worked so hard, just because of a ring, she had told him to not come back anymore, and that he didn't have to pay her back while all Andreas did was tell her to wait. With tears running down her eyes, she started to cry uncontrollably as she thought about how she said something so cruel to him, and that she told him not to come back, further claiming that she didn't mean to say any of that. She kept crying. Andreas then came closer to Amy and patted her head, calling her silly, and told her that of course he knew that. Further, Andreas told her that from now on, he would behave like a responsible brother. Amy still could not stop crying and said that she had always believed in him, but back then she was just so mad, to which Andreas responded stating how he knew it. Looking at the two siblings, Lupin also felt a sense of joy and couldn't stop her tears of happiness.